I want you to picture a dining room with white tablecloths in candlelight, the kind of room where everyone is smiling because they've been taught to, not because they mean it. That's where I was standing when I saw my grandmother's ring on another woman's hand. Patricia was holding her wine glass a little too high, turning it so the light caught the stone, and I felt my whole body go cold in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. That ring had survived a war. It had survived a divorce, a house fire, and 40 years in a velvet box that smelled like my grandmother's perfume, and now it was on my mother-in-law's finger at her own anniversary dinner, and she was laughing at something my husband's uncle had said like she didn't have a care in the world. I set my fork down very carefully. I remember thinking about how strange it was that my hands weren't shaking, because everything inside me was, "Patricia," I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "That's my ring." The table went quiet, the way tables do, when everyone already knows something is wrong, and they're just waiting to see how wrong it's going to get. Patricia looked down at her hand like she was noticing the ring for the first time, then back at me, and she smiled. Not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. "Oh, this old thing," she said, and she actually laughed a little. "Daniel gave it to me months ago. He said family jewelry should stay in the family." She took a sip of her wine. "I just assumed you knew." I looked at my husband. Daniel wouldn't look at me. That was the moment I understood that the man I married had been lying to me for months, and the woman across the table had been wearing my grandmother's ring to church. But I want to back up, because you need to understand how we got to that dining room, and how a marriage that started with so much promise ended with me sitting across from a thief wearing my own family's blood, sweat, and history on her hand like a trophy. Let me tell you how it all started. My name is Alina, and by the time I met Daniel, I had already built a life I was proud of. I want to say that plainly, because everything that came after only makes sense if you understand what I brought into that marriage. I started my own design consulting firm at 26 with $11,000 in savings and a laptop that overheated if I ran too many programs at once. I worked out of coffee shops for 2 years. I took meetings in my car so clients wouldn't hear my roommate's television through the wall. By the time I was 32, I had a staff of 9, an office downtown, and a house I had bought with my own money. A narrow brick house with a garden I'd rebuilt with my own hands, planting hydrangeas along a fence I'd painted myself on a Saturday afternoon with sore shoulders and a proud, quiet kind of happiness. I tell you this not to brag, but because it matters later. Everything I had, I built before Daniel ever walked into my life, the house, the business. The jewelry, which wasn't just jewelry, it was the only physical thread connecting me to a mother who died when I was 23. And a grandmother who raised me every summer of my childhood in a kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and dish soap. I met Daniel at a mutual friend's wedding. He was funny in that self-deprecating way that makes you feel like you're the only one who really gets his jokes. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers, or so I thought at the time. He worked in logistics, made a modest but steady salary, and seemed, more than anything, relieved to have found someone who didn't need him to be more than he was. I fell for him slowly and then all at once, the way you're supposed to. We dated for 2 years. When he proposed on the back porch of my house with the hydrangeas blooming behind him, I cried real tears, the kind that surprise you. I wanted to be honest about something. My lawyer suggested a prenuptial agreement given the disparity in her assets, and I brought it to Daniel gently, almost apologetically, worried he'd feel insulted. He didn't. He signed it without complaint, told me it made sense, told me he loved me for reasons that had nothing to do with money. I remember feeling grateful for that. I remember thinking I'd found one of the good ones. What the prenup protected was the house, my business, my savings. What it didn't protect, what no lawyer thinks to write into a contract, was 3 pieces of jewelry sitting in a safe in my closet. Because who protects sentiment with legal language? Who imagines that jewelry needs its own paper trail? 6 months into the marriage, I gave Daniel a key to the house. I remember the exact moment. He was standing in the kitchen in his work clothes, and I pressed the key into his palm and said something like, "Welcome home for real this time," and he kissed my forehead and told me it meant everything to him. I want you to hold on to that image because it becomes important. A key handed over in love, in trust, in the ordinary hope that comes with sharing your life with someone. I had no idea what that key would eventually be used for. I had no idea that trust, once given, doesn't come with an expiration date or a warning label. Patricia, Daniel's mother, was a fixture in his life in a way I underestimated before the wedding. I'd met her a handful of times while we were dating, always in public, always polite, in that brittle, performative way some people are polite. It wasn't until we were married and living together that I understood what close with his mother actually meant in practice. The first time she let herself into our house, I was in the shower. I came downstairs in a towel to find her sitting at my kitchen island, drinking coffee she'd made herself, flipping through a magazine like she lived there. "Oh, don't mind me," she said, not looking up. "Daniel gave me a key ages ago in case of emergencies." There was no emergency. She just wanted to see the new curtains. I brought it up to Daniel that night, trying to keep my voice light, the way you do when you're testing whether something is actually a problem or just a personality quirk you need to get used to. "She let herself in today," I said, while I was in the shower. He didn't even look up from his phone. "That's just Mom. She's harmless." "I'd rather she text first." "You're overreacting. She raised me in that house key kind of family. It's normal for her." I let it go. That's the thing nobody tells you about boundary violations. The first one is always small enough to seem unreasonable to object to. You feel like the difficult one for even bringing up. A few weeks later, I noticed one of my favorite blouses missing from the closet. I found it a month after that in a photo on Patricia's social media, worn to her book club, tagged with a caption about treating myself. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he laughed. "She probably just borrowed it. You have like 40 blouses, Elena." "That's not the point." "You're being possessive over a shirt." Then it was food. I'd come home from a long day to find half my groceries gone, a note on the counter in Patricia's looping handwriting, "Borrowed some things for Sunday dinner. Hope you don't mind." So, I did mind. I minded that she'd let herself in again to take them. Then it was the furniture. I came home one Tuesday to find my living room rearranged. The armchair I'd found at an estate sale moved to a different wall, a side table gone entirely, replaced with one I didn't recognize. "Mom thought the flow was off," Daniel explained, like this was a perfectly normal thing for a grown woman to walk into her son's marital home and decide. "Where's my side table?" "She took it to get refinished. As a gift. You're welcome, I guess." I stood in my own living room, in a house I had bought with my own money, looking at furniture that had been moved without my permission by a woman who had let herself in with a key my husband gave her, and I felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't quite anger. It was closer to a low, persistent unease, the kind that hums under everything else, quiet enough to ignore during the day and loud enough to keep you up at night. Each time I raised it, Daniel had an answer ready. "You're overreacting. You're being dramatic. She means well. This is just how my family is." And each time I believed him a little, because believing him was easier than believing my husband didn't have my back. I didn't know yet that these small violations were rehearsal. I didn't know they were teaching Patricia something important, that my boundaries were negotiable, that Daniel would always choose her comfort over my objections, that the house I'd built could be treated like communal property if she just asked sweetly enough, or didn't ask at all. I need to tell you about the jewelry now, because you have to understand what these pieces meant before you understand what it felt like to lose them. The ring, the one Patricia wore that night at dinner, belonged to my grandmother. It was a 1940s emerald-cut diamond in a rose gold setting, small by today's standards, maybe 3/4 of a carat, but the gold had been worn smooth and warm over 8 decades of being on someone's hand. My grandfather bought it with money he'd saved working double shifts at a mill for 2 years. My grandmother wore it every day of her 51-year marriage, through his death, through raising 4 children, mostly alone in her later years, through the summers she spent teaching me to bake bread and keep a stubborn rosebush alive. When she died, she left it to me specifically, not to my cousins, not to my aunts, to me, with a note that said, "For the girl who never stopped visiting." The earrings were my mother's. Simple diamond studs, teardrop-shaped, nothing extravagant, but she'd worn them on her wedding day, and then almost every day after that until she got sick. I have a photograph of her wearing them at my 8th birthday party, laughing at something out of frame, and every time I looked at those earrings I could hear that laugh. She died when I was 23, breast cancer, 7 months from diagnosis to funeral, and those earrings were one of the only things of hers I could touch without feeling like I was drowning. The pendant was different, not inherited, but given. A sapphire on a thin gold chain, the exact deep blue of a late evening sky. My father bought it for me the day I graduated with my business degree, the same year I started the consulting firm that would eventually build everything else I owned. He wasn't a man who said, "I'm proud of you," easily, but he'd put that box in my hands at a diner after the ceremony and said, "Your mother would have loved to see this," and I understood that the pendant was every word he couldn't quite say. I kept all 3 pieces in a small safe in my closet behind a shelf of sweaters, and I want to tell you about the night I showed them to Daniel because it matters so much in hindsight. We'd been married about a year, I'd had a glass of wine, and I was in a nostalgic mood, and I opened the safe and laid all 3 pieces out on the bed and told him everything. The mill wages, the rose bush, my mother's laugh at my 8th birthday, my father at the diner. Daniel sat next to me and nodded along, ran his thumb over the ring, said, "That's really special, Elle," in a voice that sounded, at the time, like he meant it. I know now that he was listening for a different reason than I thought. I know now that he was cataloging value, not memory. I told him the combination to the safe a few months later in the offhand way you tell your spouse things because you stopped thinking of your life as separate from theirs. I didn't think twice about it. Why would I? He was my husband. The whole point of marriage, I thought, was that there was no longer a version of mine that excluded him. I didn't know he was already watching me enter that combination every time I opened it, memorizing the pattern of my fingers on the keypad, the way you'd memorize a song you didn't know you'd need later. It started with the earrings. I reached for them one morning, getting ready for a client dinner, and the small velvet pouch where I kept them was empty. I remember standing there with the pouch in my hand, turning it inside out like the earrings might materialize from a fold I'd missed. I told myself I'd misplaced them. I searched my jewelry box, my dresser drawers, the pockets of coats I hadn't worn in months. I got down on my knees and checked under the bed with a flashlight. Nothing. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he shrugged. "You probably left them somewhere. You've been so busy with work lately." "I don't just lose my mother's earrings, Daniel." "You have so much jewelry, Elena, it's not that deep." "It's not that deep." I let that sit for a second, the casual dismissal of it, and told myself he just didn't understand, that men sometimes don't grasp what objects can mean. 3 weeks later, the pendant disappeared. This time I really did tear the house apart. I emptied every drawer in my bedroom onto the bed. I checked the car, the gym bag, the pockets of every jacket I owned. I called the dry cleaner in case it had somehow ended up in a coat pocket. I retraced my last 2 weeks hour by hour, trying to remember the last time I'd definitely seen it around my neck. I found nothing, and the panic that had been a low hum before was becoming something louder. 2 pieces, Daniel. In 3 weeks. Something is wrong. Or you're just stressed and disorganized right now. You've had a lot going on. I am not disorganized about my mother's jewelry. He sighed the particular sigh of a man being patient with a woman he thinks is being unreasonable. I don't know what you want me to say. I haven't touched your jewelry. I believed him. That's the part that's hardest to admit now. I believed my husband when he told me, to my face, in our bedroom, that he hadn't touched the things I loved most in the world, while he was, in fact, the one who had taken them. Then the ring disappeared. I noticed it on a Sunday morning. I'd taken it out 2 days earlier to clean it, a small ritual I did every few months, polishing the gold with a soft cloth at the kitchen table, while Daniel read something on his phone across from me. I remembered putting it back in the safe. I remembered the click of the door. When I opened the safe that Sunday, it wasn't there. I sat on the floor of my closet for a long time, not crying, not yet, just sitting, staring at an empty space where 3 generations of my family used to live, trying to make my mind accept what my mind did not want to accept, that someone in my own house had been taking things from me, one careful piece at a time, and that the person I trusted most kept telling me I was imagining it. I confronted Daniel that night, and for the first time something in his face flickered. Not guilt exactly, but a kind of calculation, like he was recalculating how much longer he could hold the story together. "Maybe you should see someone," he said quietly. "About the stress. You've been so anxious lately, Elle. I'm worried about you. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's the moment everything tipped from confusion into something darker. My husband was not just failing to help me find missing heirlooms, he was suggesting that the problem was my mind. I didn't sleep that night. I lay next to Daniel, listening to him breathe evenly beside me, and I made a decision I hadn't fully admitted to myself I was capable of making. The next day, while he was at work, I bought a small camera disguised as a phone charger and plugged it into an outlet near my closet, angled toward the safe. I told myself I was probably wrong. I told myself I'd find nothing, that the footage would show a woman losing her mind over misplaced jewelry, and that I'd delete it and apologize to Daniel in my head for the suspicion. I checked the footage 3 days later, alone in the house, my laptop balanced on my knees at the kitchen table. I watched Daniel come home from work. I watched him go upstairs, not to our bedroom to change, but straight to my closet. I watched him kneel in front of the safe and enter the code, my grandmother's birth year, the code I had told him without a second thought, and open it. He didn't hesitate at first. He reached in and lifted out the small velvet box that held the ring, and for a moment he just held it, turning it in the light the way I used to, and something in his expression made my stomach drop, because it wasn't guilt. It was appraisal. Then he did hesitate. I watched his thumb run over the setting, watched him glance toward the closet door like some part of him knew he shouldn't be doing this, and then he pocketed it anyway, closed the safe, and walked out of frame like a man closing a cabinet after grabbing a snack. I sat very still after that. I made myself watch it again. And then I made myself watch the earlier footage, the earrings disappearing 3 weeks before, the pendant 2 weeks after that. Each theft small and quiet and deliberate, my husband letting himself into my closet while I was at work or asleep, taking pieces of my mother and my grandmother and putting them in his pocket like they were his to take. I want to describe what that felt like, because betrayal is too small a word for it. It felt like the floor of the house I owned had opened up beneath me. It felt like every conversation where he told me I was overreacting replayed itself in my head with a new, sickening subtitle underneath. He knew. He knew the whole time. Once I knew Daniel had taken the jewelry, the next question was obvious, and it made my skin crawl to think about where had it gone. I didn't have to look far. Patricia's social media account, which she updated with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd never learned about privacy settings, told me everything. A photo from her bridge club, 6 weeks old, her hand resting on the table in a way that showed off diamond studs I would have recognized anywhere. A photo from church, my sapphire pendant catching the light at her collarbone, the caption reading, "Feeling blessed today." And then, more recently, a close-up of her hand at a friend's birthday dinner, my grandmother's ring on her finger, captioned, "A little something special, gifted with love." Gifted with love. I read that caption maybe a dozen times. I saved every photo. I noted every date. I built a timeline on a notepad at my kitchen table. The day each piece disappeared, cross-referenced with the day it first appeared on Patricia's account, sometimes only days apart. It wasn't circumstantial anymore. It was documented, dated, and public, posted by a woman too entitled to imagine she'd ever be caught, let alone held accountable. Then I called my father. I hadn't told him yet what was happening. Some instinct in me wanted to have everything laid out clearly before I brought him into it, because I knew what it would do to him. My father was not an emotional man in the way some people are. He showed love through preparation, through showing up, through doing the practical things nobody thinks to thank you for. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long silence on the phone, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone very quiet and very steady in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. "I have the receipts," he said, "for the pendant. I kept everything. I'll find the certificate for your mother's earrings, too. The jeweler put it in the little folder. I know I have it somewhere." 2 days later, he showed up at my house with a manila envelope. Inside were the original receipts, appraisal documents, and even old photographs. My mother wearing the earrings at their wedding, me at my grandmother's kitchen table as a teenager with the ring already old and gleaming on her hand in the background. My father and me at the diner the day he gave. Me the pendant, his younger, softer face smiling at the camera. "This is yours," he said, sliding the envelope across the table to me, "every piece of it. There's no confusion here, Elle. Not for a court, not for anyone." I looked at the documents laid out on the table where I'd once shown Daniel the jewelry itself, trusting him with the story behind each piece, and I felt something in me settle into a colder, clearer place. The panic was gone. The confusion was gone. What remained was purpose. I want to be honest about something. I could have confronted Daniel and Patricia quietly in my own kitchen without an audience. Some people would tell you that's the more mature choice, the private conversation instead of the public reckoning. I chose differently, and I don't regret it. I chose differently because Patricia had spent months wearing my family's jewelry in public, at church, at bridge club, at every social gathering where someone might compliment her on it, and I wanted the truth to travel exactly as far as the lie had. I wanted the same rooms that had watched her preen in my grandmother's ring to watch her explain where it came from. The opportunity arrived in the form of Patricia and Gordon's 40th wedding anniversary, a dinner they'd been planning for months, with nearly 40 family members and close friends expected. Patricia had specifically asked weeks earlier whether I'd be attending, and I remember the strange, savoring tone in her voice when she said it. like she already knew somehow that I'd be watching her enjoy what she'd taken. I spent the 2 weeks before that dinner doing 3 things. First, I organized the evidence, the security footage, edited down to the clearest and most damning clips, the timeline, Patricia's own social media photos, dated and cross-referenced, my father's receipts and certificates, scanned and printed. I put together a short presentation, the kind you'd use for a business pitch, except the product I was proving wasn't a company's growth potential, it was theft. Second, I called my father and asked if he'd come to the dinner prepared to speak if it came to that. He didn't ask a single question about why. He just said, "I'll be there. Bring the folder too, just in case they try to argue." Third, I said nothing to Daniel. I let him believe everything was normal. I let him believe I still didn't know. I smiled at him over dinner in the 2 weeks leading up to that anniversary party, asked him about his day, slept beside him at night, and every single time some part of me was thinking about the footage of his hand closing around my grandmother's ring. I won't pretend that was easy. Playing a role in your own marriage, pretending not to know your husband is a thief and a liar, takes a particular kind of discipline, but I told myself it was temporary. I told myself the truth was coming, and when it did, I wanted it to land exactly where it would do the most damage to the lie, in public, in front of the people who mattered most to both of them. The venue was a banquet room Patricia had rented for the occasion, string lights overhead, a long table set with white linens and centerpieces of white roses that smelled almost too sweet, cutting through the mingling scent of wine and perfume and someone's cologne applied a little too generously. Patricia had clearly spent the day at the salon. Her hair was set in soft waves, and when she came to greet me at the door, I caught the specific cloying scent of her perfume, the one she always wore, something floral and heavy that I would forever associate afterward with the particular taste of betrayal. And there it was, my grandmother's ring, on her right hand, catching the light of the string lights every time she gestured, which was often. "Elena, don't you look lovely?" she said, air-kissing my cheek. "I'm so glad you can make it." "Wouldn't miss it," I said, and I meant that more than she understood. I found my father near the bar, a glass of water in his hand instead of wine, which told me he was taking this as seriously as I'd asked him to. He caught my eye and gave the smallest nod. The projector and screen I'd arranged with the venue coordinator earlier that week, under the pretense of wanting to show a slideshow of family memories, as a surprise anniversary gift, sat quietly at the front of the room, waiting. Daniel found me near the appetizers, put his hand on the small of my back, told me I looked beautiful. I smiled at him and said thank you, and if my voice shook at all, he mistook it for sentimentality about his parents' anniversary. Dinner passed the way these dinners always do. Toasts, laughter, Gordon standing to talk about 40 years with the same woman in a voice thick with genuine emotion, Patricia dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, the whole room warm with the performance of a happy family. I watched her ring catch the candlelight throughout the meal and felt the cold, steady certainty of what was coming settle deeper into my chest. After dessert, as the toast wound down and people began that restless shuffle toward coffee and conversation, I stood. "Before everyone scatters," I said, my voice carrying more easily than I expected, "I actually put together a little slideshow. Family memories in honor of 40 years, I gestured to the projector. Would anyone mind if I shared it?" There was a murmur of delighted surprise. Patricia clapped her hands together, genuinely pleased, no idea what was coming. Daniel smiled at me from across the table, proud, oblivious. I walked to the front of the room, plugged in my laptop, and turned to face nearly 40 people who loved this family, or thought they did. "Actually," I said, before the memories, "there's something else I need to show you first." The first slide was a photograph of my grandmother, young, in the 1940s, the ring already on her hand, taken the year my grandfather bought it. I told the room briefly, calmly, what that ring meant, the mill wages, the 51 years of marriage, the note that came with it when she died, for the girl who never stopped visiting. The room was quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when people sense something serious is coming and don't yet know what. The second slide was a photo of my mother in her wedding dress, the diamond earrings catching the church light. I talked about her laugh, about the 8-year-old birthday party, about the 7 months between diagnosis and funeral. I saw a few people wipe their eyes. I saw Patricia's smile beginning, almost imperceptibly, to falter, though she still hadn't understood where this was going. The third slide was the sapphire pendant, my father's face beside mine at that diner, 22 years old, degree in hand. I told them what my father had said, the words he almost never let himself say directly. These 3 pieces, I said, my voice steady, were the only things I had left of the 2 most important women in my life, and the pride of the man who's sitting right there. I gestured to my father, who did not smile, whose face had settled into something granite and unmoving. A few months ago, all 3 of them disappeared from a safe in my own closet. I clicked to the next slide. It was a still frame from the security footage. Daniel, kneeling in front of the safe, my grandmother's ring in his hand. The gasp that went through the room was audible. I watched Daniel's face drain of color in real time, watched him half rise from his chair like his body wanted to physically stop what was happening before his mind had caught up to the fact that it was already too late. "Elena," he started. "I'm not finished," I said, and something in my voice made him sit back down. I played the clip. 30 seconds of my husband opening my safe with a code I had trusted him with, lifting out the ring, hesitating. The room watched him hesitate, watched the small moment where some part of him clearly knew what he was doing was wrong, and then pocketing it anyway. I clicked through the footage of the earrings, the pendant, each theft dated on screen, each one landing on the room like a slap. "And this," I said, clicking to the next slide, "is where they ended up." Patricia's own photographs filled the screen. Her hand at bridge club with the earrings glinting, her collarbone at church with the pendant, her finger at a friend's birthday dinner with the ring, the caption "Gifted with love" displayed in her own handwriting for the whole room to read. "Gifted with love," I repeated, looking directly at her. "By a man who stole them from his own wife, out of a safe, in the middle of the night, over 3 separate visits, because he watched me enter the code and never told me he was memorizing it." Patricia's face went through several things very quickly. First, denial. "This is a misunderstanding, Elena. You don't understand the context." Then, when no one in the room seemed inclined to help her find that context, something closer to panic, her hands fluttering to the ring on her finger, like she might hide it by covering it with her other hand. Then, finally, tears, the kind that come fast and desperate when you realize the story you've been telling yourself is collapsing in front of an audience. "I didn't know they were stolen. I swear, Daniel told me they were his to give." "He told you," I said, "that jewelry belonging to my dead mother and my dead grandmother was his to give away, and you believed that because it was convenient for you to believe it." Daniel, for his part, had gone the color of the tablecloth, stammering something that started with, "It's not what it looks like," and dissolved into silence when literally everyone in the room, including his own father, looked at him like he'd grown a second head. I glanced around as the room absorbed it. Someone's aunt with her hand pressed to her mouth, a cousin already recording quietly on her phone, a ripple of whispered "did you know" passing table to table, Patricia's oldest friend from Bridge Club quietly setting down her wine glass and moving her chair, a few inches away from her, like proximity itself might be contagious. And then Gordon stood up. "I want to tell you about my father-in-law, because up until that night, I mostly knew him as a quiet man at the head of family dinners, a man who said grace with his eyes actually closed, who fixed things around the house instead of talking about his feelings, who had, as far as I could tell, exactly one unbending rule that governed his entire life: he could not stand a liar." He stood up slowly, the way a much older man might, though he wasn't old, just suddenly heavier with something he was carrying. The room went silent in a different way than before, not the hush of shock, but the hush of respect, because everyone at that table understood that Gordon didn't speak often, and when he did, it mattered. 40 years, he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word, the first crack I had ever heard in it. 40 years I have stood in front of people and told them that this family means something, that our word means something. He looked at Patricia, and I watched something in his face break that I don't think ever fully repaired. I built a life on the idea that I married an honest woman, and I raised a son I believed had that same honesty in him. He turned to Daniel. "You didn't just steal from your wife. You stole from a dead woman's memory and a dead woman's memory, and you let your mother parade them around like she'd earned them." His voice rose now, not shouting, but filled with a controlled fury that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "You let her wear them to church, Daniel, to church." He looked back at Patricia. "I don't know what you told yourself to make this feel all right. I don't want to know. But you will take that ring off your hand right now, and every other piece, and it will go back to Elena tonight, not tomorrow, not after you've had time to come up with a better story. Tonight?" Patricia was sobbing now, working the ring off her finger with shaking hands, and I felt nothing but a cold, clean relief watching it. I built my whole life on being a man of my word, Gordon said, quieter now, and it was somehow worse quiet than loud. And I am standing here in front of everyone who has ever respected that, telling you both that you have humiliated me, not embarrassed me, humiliated me. He looked at me then, and something in his face softened, just for me. Elena, I am so sorry. This family owes you more than an apology, and I intend to see that you get more than that. I didn't cry. I'd promised myself. I wouldn't, not in that room, not in front of them. But something in my chest loosened slightly at those words, the first real acknowledgement I'd had in months that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't been overreacting, that a man of principle could look at what had happened to me and call it exactly what it was. Daniel didn't speak until we were in the car. The party behind us in pieces, the earrings and pendant and ring sitting in a small velvet pouch in my purse, returned to me finally by a shaking, red-eyed Patricia in the parking lot while Gordon watched to make sure she did it properly. Elena, please, Daniel started, somewhere around the second stoplight, I can explain. Explain what, exactly? My voice came out flat, almost bored, though nothing about how I felt was boring. Explain why you watched me enter the code to my safe and never told me. Explain why you sat next to me while I cried about missing jewelry and told me I was imagining things. I didn't think it would hurt you this much. I thought, Mom always said family things should stay in the family, and I thought maybe you wouldn't even notice for a while, and by the time you did, it would just be done, you know, water under the bridge. I looked out the window at the passing streetlights and said nothing, because there was nothing to say to a man who thought stealing his wife's dead mother's earrings could ever, under any circumstance, become water under the bridge. His phone buzzed twice on the console between us. Patricia's name lit up the screen both times. He didn't answer it, and for once, I think even he understood that answering it in that moment would have been the wrong kind of loyalty. We drove the rest of the way home in silence, and I remember feeling strangely calm, not the calm of forgiveness, but the calm of a decision already made, sitting quietly and completely formed in the back of my mind, waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. I gave it 3 days. I wanted Daniel to sit with what he'd done without the distraction of damage control, without me softening the blow before he'd fully understood the size of it. On the 4th day, I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once shown him the jewelry and told him its history, the same table where he'd once nodded along like he cared, and I slid a folder across to him. This is a postnuptial agreement, I said. My lawyer drew it up this week. It formalizes what should have already been obvious, that everything I built before this marriage and everything I build during it stays mine. No shared claim, no ambiguity, nothing left open to interpretation. He opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady and read through it slowly, his jaw tightening as he got further in. Elena, this feels like you're preparing to leave. I'm preparing for the possibility, I said, because you've shown me exactly what you're capable of when you think I won't notice. I'm not interested in guessing anymore. I told him the other terms as well. Patricia was not permitted in my house again, under any circumstance, with or without him present. If she attempted to contact me, I would not respond. If any item in this house, jewelry or otherwise, ever went missing again, I would go to the police with the footage I still had saved in 3 separate places, and I would press charges, and I would not care how that affected his relationship with his mother, because he had made his choice about whose comfort mattered more the day he chose her over me, over and over, for months. I love you, he said quietly, and it was the first time in the whole conversation his voice sounded like it might actually be telling the truth. I know, I said. That was never really the question. He signed the agreement. His hand shook slightly on the signature line, and I watched him sign it, and I felt something settle in me that was not quite peace, but was something adjacent to it. The particular relief of a woman who has finally stopped waiting for someone else to protect what's hers, and has decided to protect it herself instead. I think about that dinner table a lot now. The one where Patricia smiled at me with my grandmother's ring on her finger and told me without an ounce of shame that she'd assumed I already knew. Looking back, I don't think the jewelry was ever really about the jewelry, not for her. It was about what she believed she was entitled to. The idea that anything within her son's reach was also within hers, that boundaries were suggestions, that my history and my grief and my family's memory could simply become hers if she wanted it badly enough and nobody stopped her. Nobody had ever stopped her in 40 years because Daniel never learned how, and Gordon, for all his principles, had never had a reason to look closely enough to see what she was capable of. I stopped her. Not by screaming, not by begging my husband to see me, but by doing the quiet, unglamorous work of gathering the truth and setting it down in front of people who couldn't look away from it. I think about what it means to build something with your own hands. A business, a house, a family history kept safe in a small metal box, and to have someone you love decide, quietly and repeatedly, that what's yours is negotiable. I think about how long I let myself be talked out of trusting my own instincts. How many times your overreacting almost convinced me that my own grief and confusion weren't real. They were real. And I'm glad, in the end, that I trusted them enough to find out the truth, even when the truth was the last thing I wanted to see. My grandmother's ring is back on my hand now, where it belongs. My mother's earrings sit in a new safe, one only I know the code to. My father's pendant hangs around my neck most days, a small, deliberate reminder that some things are worth protecting fiercely, even from the people who are supposed to love you the most. So let me ask you this. If you found out someone in your own family had done what Daniel and Patricia did to me, would you have handled it the way I did? Would you have gone public or kept it private? And would you have pressed charges? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one,